Welcome back after the coffee break. My name is Gunilla Herolf. I'm from the Royal Swedish Academy of War Sciences in Stockholm, and I will be chairing this session. Seldom has the European Union been facing so many problems, internal, regional, and global ones, at the same time. And at the same time, the European Union is also expected to become or be a global player, to be able to not only address all these problems, but also to be able to speak with one voice in addressing them. The name of this session, which is about these things, is Towards a Common Voice in the International Arena, Transatlantic Partnership, Development Cooperation, International Trade and Security. This is indeed a tall order for a session, but I'm lucky because I have a very distinguished panel around me to address these issues, and we will have 5 to 7 minutes intervention from each of them, and then we will have questions and answers and internal discussion among us. So I will ask the first speaker now to start, and this will not be Mr. Piebalgs, according to which the program says he will have the privilege of speaking as the last one in terms of his enormous experience in this area. We want his comments immediately after the other ones. That will be a privilege for us. So the first speaker will instead be Professor Federico Steinberg from the Real Institute Elcano in Madrid, who is a senior analyst for economy and international trade at the Elcano, and he's also professor of economic analysis at the Universidad Autonómica in Madrid. So please, Mr. Steinberg.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. And I'm going to focus on two topics. I thought I was going to talk more about international monetary affairs and the role of the euro in this post-crisis environment, but suddenly everybody's telling me that the hot topic is TTIP. So I'm going to cut 3 minutes on monetary issues, 3 minutes on TTIP. So to start with, let's say that we can all agree that the world is changing rapidly. We are moving into a geopolitical order with more rivalry, more emerging powers trying to get a seat on the table. The American decline is not really an American decline, but the European decline could be something more significant, particularly taking into account demographic trends. So basically, I think we can all agree that Europe needs to get its act together and try to speak with one voice in more issues at the international arena. If we don't do it, it's pretty clear that our influence is going to be reducing over time, and our power and our welfare probably even faster. So on the monetary issue, I think that provided that we are able to keep the euro alive, and this is a big if, and I will go to Professor Tsoukalis's comment this morning, this is not guaranteed, but the interesting thing is that in order for the euro to make it sustainable, we have to take several steps, and we've been taking them, that will make it a much more attractive international currency, and also that will probably facilitate the fact that the euro could speak with one voice in international fora as the IMF, G20, etc. Let me explain briefly. Basically, most of the elements why the euro has not been regarded as something that can challenge the dollar or compete with the yuan in 20 years' time is because the euro is an orphan currency. It has no military to back it up, and it has an incomplete governance structure, so nobody really knows who's the ultimate taxpayer behind the euro. And secondly, in more material terms, because international markets for euro-denominated assets, particularly the 10-year bonds, if you want, are not as deep, as broad, and as liquid as for the US dollar. But keep in mind that if we succeed in what we're trying to do with the Eurozone in terms of building a banking union, a fiscal union, better representation, we're not going to have a Euro military, but that's a topic I'll leave for the other members of the panel. And we finally start issuing something like Eurobonds in the next years, and the things that the ESM issues are actually something like a Eurobond, we could have some of these shortcomings addressed. And that means that probably one of the things that the euro has, which is a very conservative central bank in terms of inflation, actually is something that savers from China to Saudi Arabia to other emerging markets that care about the purchasing power of their savings value. So my point would be that if the euro succeeds, we can start thinking about having a more important role of the euro in the international arena, and this probably can give us more influence abroad if we want to use it, and it's up to the discussion if we want the euro as a reserve currency or not. Germany has traditionally not been very prone for this. France like that idea. It's an open question. And more importantly, in the international institutions, we already have a common voice at the G20, for instance. It's difficult to keep it, but just let's think for a minute about the IMF. I think that the trend towards moving towards an external, a common position from the Eurozone members, not for the EU probably, is something that sooner or later will have to happen. And actually, we could actually use the ESM as a model for how to coordinate that. I'll talk about that more in detail if you want in the Q&A session. Now, just some ideas on trade. 2 minutes. I totally agree with what was said this morning about the TTIP is not about economics. TTIP is about geopolitics. So the gains from trade from TTIP are highly controversial, but we can all agree that we're here 20 years ago, we'll be here 20 years from now, and if we decided to go the way of TTIP now, is more because of a number of geopolitical events that are affecting us, and we wanted first to confront this idea that the Atlantic is dead and the future is the Pacific. Nothing happens in the Atlantic, everything happens in the Pacific. We wanted to, give a different narrative for that. And second, the narrative that the future is of emerging markets and not of old European societies, also a counterbalance for that. So we were more than happy to accept the invitation, or for the Americans to accept our invitations to start talking about these issues, and to try to set, if you want, the rules of the game for the trade in the 21st century in a trade that's going to be mainly about services and where regulation is not written yet. So we are trying here, I think, to write, if you want, the rules of GATT 2.0, in which we have the lead, and if emerging markets want to sell to the big market of Europe and the US with the highest purchasing power in the world, they will have to adopt our norms. Now, this looks very good, and on the other hand, we Europeans are quite happy that the Americans want us on board, because the Americans also have a strategy on the Pacific, which is TPP, and is also interesting, and maybe it's not so compatible with TTIP, but that's another story. The problem is that whereas we have trade agreements between the EU and someone else, or the US and someone else, the balance of power is always in favor of the big country. And this is the first time where we have the two biggest trading partners trying to negotiate an agreement. And the agreement is not about tariffs. This would be very easy to do. Manufacturing tariffs are already very low, so putting them to zero is not the issue. The issue is about common rules, harmonization or mutual recognition. And here is where we have the problem, because so far we've had 7 rounds, and as far as I know, we have not been able to agree on anything yet on any of the topics of the agenda, which is really, frustrating. Or basically that reflects very different cultures on the regulatory side. And if we go back to our own European history, it took us 30 years to agree that mutual recognition was a possibility to be able to bring forward things. And therefore, only harmonization came only after, with the new issues that had to be regulated. I am a bit skeptical about the possibility that we can have mutual recognition with the US in all issues. And I'm very certain that we will not have harmonization on most of them. And the fact that financial services are out of the agenda because the US didn't want to talk about them is a clear example of that. What I want to point out is that the best we can hope for TTIP, I think, at this point, is to have some sort of limited agreement so that we can send the political message that this has not failed, which I think is very important because the political stakes are high and we cannot do as we did in Doha, that we just say it's not working. Now it seems Doha is working, but 10 years later than it should have. So basically, we can hope for a small agreement to cut tariffs, an agreement to have platforms to regulate things that have not been regulated in the future, either in common or at least in consultation, and that's interesting because trade in global value-added chains is changing the nature of trade, and there are many things that will need to be regulated in the future, property rights issues, the digital economy, etc. So that's good to have a dialogue. But honestly, I think it's more reasonable to have a different step process in which we have something before the elections in 2016 in the US, and then we continue talking about this in the future. Because if not, we're going to be very frustrated because, trade negotiations go to the very small detail, and there is where the difficulties are. So I'll leave it here and hope to continue with the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gunilla. The question the organizers have asked us to answer is the area priorities for the European Union in its international action. And I think the answer here is quite clear. The area should be a priority of the European continent at the moment because the EU's attraction and its ability to influence global events depends very much on its record of success in peaceful cooperation on its own continent of Europe. But what we are seeing now is a very serious challenge to the European security order. It's not, what I must stress, a local conflict between Ukraine and Russia. What is at stake and why it's of first order importance for the European Union, and I would argue here it should be the very first priority, is the fundamental principles of the European security order, of international law, which have been violated by Russia in this case. Things such as moving borders, changing borders by force, defending ethnic compatriots, wherever they may be, going beyond simply defending citizens, but simply Russian speakers in territories beyond, and making a claim for a special Russian civilization, a claim which is then broadcast by Sputnik, formerly known as RT, formerly known as Russia Today, which directly challenges European values and spreads not just disinformation, but intolerance and hatred. These challenges to the international order, I submit, are not simply a local conflict in a country we know, a faraway country we know very little about. It has implications for global developments. For instance, how can we think that the nuclear non-proliferation regime will continue when the Crimea or the territorial sovereignty of Ukraine was guaranteed by the Budapest Memorandum in exchange for Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons in 1994. How can the European Union, in one of its greater priorities, where it's invested a lot of capital over the last few years of getting a deal with Iran on Iran's nuclear issues, how can the Iranians be convinced that giving up on the idea of going nuclear and receiving some sort of assurances and guarantees in return will be enough for their security? And I would argue also that Russia's own actions are perhaps in the short term successful, but in the long term against the fundamental interests of Russia itself. What if Russia is a declining power, China is a rising power? What if China starts applying the same sort of logic as Russia in its own neighborhood, in the South China Sea with its neighbors? Or even, perhaps not entirely so far-fetched in the more distant future, if China decides to protect the millions of Chinese speakers in Russia's Far East. So Russia, by challenging the basic international rules, has opened up a series of problems not simply for Europe, but internationally. And this is why it's an issue of first-order concern for all of us. It's not simply some post-Soviet conflict, though there are plenty in Europe who see it as such and draw the sort of conclusions that this is something that will be contagious to this region. You can't imagine how many phone calls I've gotten from journalists in Madrid, Paris, and London, and Berlin, and elsewhere over the past, say, 9 months, asking about, is Narva next? And I'm sure some of the Latvian colleagues have been getting phone calls about, is Daugavpils, is Latgale next? Because, after all, there are Russian speakers there, and this is the doctrine that Putin has announced. I always reply that, no, I'm not worried, in response to the question. I wasn't at least worried until you asked me this question. The fact that you in Madrid, Rome, or Brussels are unable to differentiate between what's going on in Crimea and what's happening in an EU and NATO country, if you see it as a common post-Soviet space, that makes me worried that we're not taken as part of the same family. And generally, it's been addressed as a question for NATO and NATO's credibility, as if this was a separate category, as if the member states of the European Union and the member states of NATO mostly don't overlap. But if there's a challenge like this, if little green men do appear in Narva or Daugavpils, that this is obviously also a challenge to the EU. I don't see the likelihood of Russian speakers in either of these areas of Estonia or Russia being attracted to what's being offered by Russia, because it's one thing to exchange Ukrainian currency for Russian rubles, but giving up the euro for the Russian ruble, I don't think is a very attractive proposition. But of course, it only takes a small group of outsiders to cause a great deal of problems. And that brings me to my main point here, which I want to discuss as the EU's sort of main tool in its foreign policy, and coming to our point about talking with and acting in a common voice. And my voice is a little bit shaky today because I have a cold. Are sanctions. And this, of course, requires one voice. I want to talk a bit about how effective the sanctions have been. It also goes to a second part in our title here about transatlantic partnership and cooperation, because the EU sanctions have, to a certain extent, been coordinated with not just the US, but also Canada, Australia, Japan, other Western countries. And this is, of course, significant because Russia naturally would prefer to divide the West in these questions, to play off Europe and North America, to divide Europe internally, because from the Russian point of view, it's the West which is imposing these sanctions. There are new elements in Russia's traditional strategy of dividing the EU. Obviously prefers to speak with the capitals rather than Brussels. That's understandable. But there's a new worrisome dimension in how Russian influence and perhaps even funding is helping to undermine the EU from the inside. And I mean here what was demonstrated very spectacular in the European parliamentary elections, the success of the extreme right. And there have been, you have undoubtedly noticed the stories by investigative reporters recently about the French Front National taking a rather large loan from a Russian bank. And one thing is the monetary trail, but the other is, as Marine Le Pen said, that money isn't affecting her course, that she would be on the same course anyhow, because they admire the values which Putin is proposing, the values which speak against the degenerate and decadent West with its tolerance for same-sex civil unions, for instance, and the like. So it is being posed as a civilizational challenge against the core values of Europe, and oddly, this Russian message is finding allies within Europe. And unlike before, these marginal groups are, in fact, getting quite a lot of influence. The numbers in the European Parliament are remarkable, and it might not be so long before some of these extreme right parties also take up a position in some of the governments in Europe. And now coming back to sanctions again, these groups, of course, can exert pressure nationally on their governments to give up on sanctions, that sanctions are bad for business, are bad for our relationships, are hurting ourselves. And so I want to discuss a little bit about the effectiveness of the sanctions. Over here, I think it's often been a sense of frustration that the sanctions have been too little, too late in responding to Crimea. Elsewhere in Europe, it has often been the other way around, that we are perhaps hurting our own economy at a time when our recovery is rather fragile. But of course, the impact on Europe's economy of Russia is not all that large. But how have the sanctions impacted? I mean, if they're designed to influence Russia's actions and behavior, how can we judge their effect? Well, they haven't been effective if one of the main aims has been to force the Russians to withdraw or to de-escalate. There's been nothing of the kind. As we know, the ceasefire, there are people being killed every day during this ceasefire. So one of the main aims of the sanctions, we can say, has failed. However, I would posit that the sanctions have been successful in forestalling or deterring any further advance of Russian influence. In other words, I'm certain that the separatists in Lugansk and Donetsk are not very happy to be contained where they are at present. They would naturally want to have the entire region of Donetsk and Luhansk under their control. So the sanctions perhaps have had a deterrent effect in retrospect. It hasn't forced the Russians to back down. And the main game then is on Putin's part, he of course has bargained for, in his actions, that there would be some Western response, but he's been surprised that it's been strong and united. And this is a great success for Europe, something that Europe can be proud of, that Europe has been united and spoken in one voice. But Putin is obviously betting that he can outlast the sanctions. The sanctions will be lifted. There'll be a reset, a return to normal, a desire to be back to business as usual. And he can stick this out longer, and the Russian people, who have a long tradition of suffering under tyrants, won't mind. So, coming to the end of my time, I would say that the recommendations then for the Latvian presidency over the next half year is to maintain unity within the European Union, to ensure that the European Union sticks to its principles and values in this, because during the presidency, the term for the first batch of sanctions expires, and there will certainly be pressure to say that, well, since there's a ceasefire, and since Russia hasn't advanced any further, then we should lift these sanctions. In other words, handing Putin a victory. He will keep Crimea. We've already forgotten about Crimea. Not too many people talk about the Malaysian airliner these days either. So Putin is playing the long game, and we have to stick to this as well, because Putin is waiting basically for a deal. And he can't understand the Europeans, why they're sticking to their values and principles. He sees this as hypocritical and disingenuous, and he's puzzled by it. That he genuinely believes that there will be some sort of, if not spheres of influence, but an acceptance that, okay, you accept that I get Crimea, and I will maybe ease up on eastern Ukraine. And of course, he's been waiting for Finlandization, something that Henry Kissinger recommended immediately already in the spring, which of course robs Ukraine of any actorness in this at all. I mean, if we apply Finlandization to Eastern Europe, as was also recommended many years ago, in our case, there wouldn't be a TEPSA meeting here today in Riga.
But in Finland.
But perhaps in Finland. So, in maintaining this unity, it's calling for sanctions to continue, of course, is not easy and appealing, but I think the Latvian presidency is in a good position to do so, because Latvia has the moral authority in this case, because it's in fact the Baltic countries, Poland, which are the most exposed and which are actually suffering the most damage to their economies and which are the most linked to the Russian market. And they are also the most strident in upholding these principles of international law. And thus, I wish the Latvian presidency resoluteness.
Our next speaker, very timely now, is Hanna Ojanen from Finland. And Hanna is a Jean Monnet professor at the Tampere University in Finland. And she is also on the TEPSA board and many other things that I will not go into now. So please, Hanna.
Thank you very much, Gunilla. I'm really, really glad and honored to have been invited to be on this panel on the EU's common voice in the world. And I would start in agreement with what Andris said when he said that the EU's global success depends on its success regionally here in Europe. What I might add to this in my own introduction is that this regional success in turn depends on the EU's internal success. I think that this is really a time of much more uncertainties than before. Gunilla referred to this. And I think we need to change our debate as well, also regarding the very notion of the EU's common voice. Thus far, we have been debating mainly the question of whether the EU is able to speak with one voice. I don't think this is the most relevant question today. Instead, we should ask whether there is anyone listening to when the EU speaks, whether anyone pays attention to what it says, and perhaps even more importantly, we should ask what this voice should be saying. So the question now is about the message and about communication. And this includes external and internal communication. The EU, as has been said already today several times, the EU is challenged simultaneously from the inside and from the outside. It is not only its capacities that are questioned, but also its fundamental principles, as you just said. So, on the one hand, fundamentals such as free movement, economic prosperity are put in question. Citizens doubt the EU's capacities and its will to address their real needs. And on the other hand, we have democracy, multilateralism, international norms being challenged by outsiders, and not only outsiders. The supporters, then, the supporting side, they are few and far between, and they speak in a rather low voice. What is more, the EU is being defined by others. It is not really defining itself. It is not telling itself what its aims are and what it stands for. Someone else is doing that for it. So it has to react to others' interpretations and their vocabulary. That is not really the vocabulary the EU has been used to using itself. Words like enemy or expansionism have entered the debate quite contrary to what the EU would say itself. No wonder then there is now more talk about the need for counter-narratives, perhaps, and the need for strategic communication. But is the EU capable of strategic communication? We might have two reasons to doubt this capacity as well. First, efforts at spreading a certain image often fail. They can also be counterproductive. And second, the EU's ability to be a strategic actor that we know has been shown to be rather poor. There is a broad consensus that the EU has not been able to define strategic partnerships in a very clear and strategic way. It has not been able to produce a real security strategy, not even to revise properly what is called the European Security Strategy. But while the EU may not be good in strategy, it may still be good in strategic communication. And I believe this European Security Strategy of 2003 is exactly this, an excellent piece of strategic communication. It tells in a short and clear way what the EU does, how it does, and why it does what it does, and how it thus may differ from other actors or be similar to some other actors. Today, I think we need a similar piece, one that, without compromising on being clear and concise, tells what the EU is about. And differently from the piece from 2003, it would need to make the link between inside and outside explicit, showing how the same principles of democracy, freedoms, well-being apply in both domains, both internally and externally. And it should also outline the modes of involvement for insiders and outsiders alike. that is saying where, when, and how they can voice their concerns and opinions, and how the EU then also protects the integrity of its own decision-making. So this is what I see as the next step in the short term also for the presidency. Update and reminder of what the EU stands for in relation to its citizens and the outside world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hanna. Thank you very much. Next speaker is Gianni Bonvicini. He is right now the Executive Vice President of the Instituto Affari Internazionali in Rome. He is also formerly the director for many years for the same institute, and he is a member of the TEPSA board. So please, Gianni.
Thank you, Gunilla. As you can easily imagine, coming from Italy, I'm going to concentrate my intervention on the role of the High Representative, who by chance is an Italian. And we know that it's a rather tough job, let's say with great responsibility, but with very limited, if no power at all. So particularly today, I think that Federica Mogherini has to deal with some clear shortcomings of European foreign policy. Starting with the, I would say, failure of neighborhood policy, European neighborhood policy. Remember that the European neighborhood policy was meant to create a ring of friends, possibly well-governed. Exactly the opposite has happened. Think to North Africa, for example. The European Union didn't succeed to adapt its neighborhood, traditional neighborhood policy to the events in Northern Africa. And I still remember the offer that the High Representative did at that time, the famous 3M. 3M meaning money, market, and migration. And there was no money at all around in Europe. The market was closed for the agricultural product, which were the main interest of Northern African countries. And finally, migration is still there, and the problem we know pretty well has not been solved. So, neighborhood policy, and the same, I think, we should also criticize the way in which the European Union has dealt with the Ukrainian case. The way in which the association offer was released before the crisis and after the crisis well described the I would say, incredible and I would very, very limited way in which the European Union has succeeded to act in the neighborhood, eastern neighborhood. And I agree that neighborhood policy as first, because its neighborhood is called, concentrate on the region, but I would also add that that is not really enough. The regional limitation, geographical limitation of neighborhood policy is an obstacle to have a more effective neighborhood policy, because it's clear that when you, for example, deal with Ukraine, you have not just to deal with neighbors, but you have to deal with Russia. The same happens in the Northern Africa, particularly if you deal with the security questions. It's difficult to consider just Northern Africa when the security problems springs out from Somalia or Mali or Sub-Saharan Africa in general. So I think extended neighborhood or neighbors of neighbors has been named in the last few months is the way to go ahead. Another concept which didn't really work very well was the policy of strategic partnership. You remember that the European Union had to launch some, let's say, activities or programs of strategic partnership. So today, really, in a multipolar world, partners do not more exist. We can call them powers or interlocutors, which have under many aspects, different interests to ours, and we have to confront with them. We have to agree to overcome rivalries, to find mediation, and so it's very difficult to think in terms of strategic partnership. We have to adapt again an old concept. And finally, the last, I would say, dimension of the European foreign policy, which is now more apt to the new time and the role that we expect by the European Union, is the so-called comprehensive approach. And the comprehensive approach is an insufficient concept if deprived of the military dimension, which is necessary to be credible, to work better in certain situations, and to enhance a European foreign security policy which might, in a way, answer the external crisis. Remember again the example of Mali, where the European Union had the possibility to intervene even militarily, and that didn't happen at all, and France took the lead. Now, these are, so what I think the very first task for the High Representative will be the one of not just revising the ESS, but to redraft completely a new vision for European foreign security policy. And we know that a part of a vision, what is really limiting the role of the High Representative is the institutional machinery itself. If you, for example, look to the very last events of European security and foreign policy, you see again here a decisive role inside the European Council. Among the European institutions, the crucial decision makers, the very last decision maker, last resort decision-making body is the European Council. And again here, you really witness, I would say, the rising of a concept of balance, or better to say, imbalance of power inside the European Council. For example, in the Ukrainian case, you see Germany prevailing on the other countries and dictating the way ahead on the policy towards Russia, for example. And that, in a way, replicate the preeminence or leadership of Germany inside the European Council, as it happened in the other sector of European policy, that is the monetary policy and financial policy. So I think that, again, we have to rebalance, in a way, the institutional setup in order to have a more visible common voice of the European Union. And I think the High Representative should then work much more in cooperation with the President of the European Council, who is by treaty also responsible for foreign and security policy. So the link between the High Representative and the President of the Council will be decisive for, let's say, also rebalancing the interest of the European Union between the East and the South. And finally, the High Representative has to work much more inside the European Commission. She has to play in full her role of Vice President of the European Commission in order to coordinate the real tools let's say, more credible European foreign and security policy. So the idea of a trio working together is, to my mind, the necessary element to, in a way, reevaluate the role of the High Representative. And secondly, she should work in common with her colleagues, national colleagues, foreign ministers, to delegate some functions and some activities to groups of foreign ministers in particular area, on particular issue. So in any case, she has to try to exploit as much as she can the few elements or factors which might favor a better performance of the role of the High Representative. And so I see here a role for the Latvian presidency to support such an effort, to support, as has been declared also this morning, the role of the High Representative. It was interesting to listen to the Deputy Undersecretary today that the very first priority of the Latvian presidency is geopolitics, and that was revealing of an interest to have a better and more effective foreign and security policy. So I wish really to the Latvian presidency to get in touch with the High Representative and the decision-making system of the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gianni, and thank you all the four speakers for very interesting insights and innovative ideas. And now we have the fifth speaker, who will be Mr. Andris Piebalgs, who has a very distinguished career within the European Commission, among other things. His latest role was Commissioner for Development, and before that he was also Commissioner for Energy, and in this role he made some extremely important progress for this particular area, and was also rewarded with a number of distinguished awards for his excellent job. Mr. Piebalgs, please give us your ideas on what you think is most important and also what has been said previously. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. It was a fascinating debate, and it looked at many aspects of speaking with one voice or common policy. There was a very interesting article recently in Der Spiegel, which went from different perspective. If you know what I speak, there was analysis done about Ukraine events, where actually it was a very strange conclusion. Even if it was European event and was done by Europe, it was German failure at the end, or Angela Merkel's failure. So it was basically that she left the events not having and putting enough attention from her own perspective. So I would disagree with the position, but that would mean that actually in Commonwealth there has been some achievements, and there is some natural resistance in the member countries, because each of them would like also to keep sovereignty. And media, also very highly qualified media, sometimes comes to strange conclusion. What would have been different if Angela Merkel, after her election, would speak about Ukraine with Putin at that stage? Would have been some changes? Well, I doubt it, but that was their perspective given. So it is need to be looked from two aspects, from the national sovereignty issue and for European common value issue. So, and there will be always this type of contradiction because it will never be perfect. So I think it is a moving target in a way. In my opinion, there are three basic reasons why we need common voice, and we have achieved quite a lot. First, conflicts. With my experience, particularly in my second part of the month, but also in the first, Europe is very well perceived and qualified dealing with conflicts. It's never 100% success, but still Europe has ability really to deal with conflicts in rather difficult situations. I would mention from my part, it's Mali, Central African Republic, but you would also say, well, with all the contradiction in the Middle East, Europe plays a very important role. And it's not a particular member country, but Europe as a whole. Also in Ukraine, I would say, it's not that Europe is just behind the scenes. Second, it is human rights. Europe is definitely champion of human rights and fight against poverty. And we know the evil starts when the human rights are not being taken attention in sovereignty, national sovereignties, and when globally we neglect that poverty makes a lot of evil in the world. And third, it is definitely Europe's own prosperity. These three aspects definitely require the 28 member states try to pool their foreign actions to, well, institutional structure that has been created by Lisbon Treaty. As at this stage, and I assume for some time, there will be not new appetite for new treaty. We should be very realistically seeing what we can get out of the current treaty as it stands. And it should not be always seen that you need to change a treaty to achieve something better off. Well, I think for me, the biggest success was a response to Ukraine events. Because adopt restrictive measures, I would call it not sanctions, it's restrictive measures, according to European dignity, is a rather challenging task. What actually Europe did, it's not the sanctions. It is, if peoples are provoking war and is there blood on the hands, how we can allow them to travel and to use their assets? It is just not dignity to us to allow. Second, if the money is used for the conflict, and we clearly have proved that Russia used its financial instruments to support the conflict, how you can allow your financial instruments to support it? And I think that was an issue that's not so simple to find the right balance, because there is more retaliation and other, but you find the right balance and all member countries stick to it. It's a difficult issue, but it has been done. Yes, it takes a time. But I could mention also the issues where Europe has led in making, well, new perspective in some potential conflict situation. Kosovo, Serbia. Well, it's not done deal, but there have been some achievement. Let's look at Iran dossier. It's still not there, but there could be substantial change because of European leadership. Speaking about TTIP and trade, well, there is Canada's agreement. And Canada is, well, very close to the United States. Well, we could argue that we will have better preference than Americans in Canada if the deal will be ratified. But that gives also more incentives also with work with TTIP. And I think for TTIP, for me, it is very important that we try to look at this agreement in all the complexity, because it's an argument, it's American. Well, it's not American. It will be two sides instruments, and there will be negotiations, and let's evaluate the agreement on the merits when the negotiator has concluded its work. But Canada agreement definitely gives a lot of optimism that something useful could be achieved. I would mention, well, on Euro, well, that is a good point. I will come to back what we have not achieved. But at least I'm very happy that now Vice President, and he has, well, origin in Latvia, was representing Eurozone in G20 meeting. For me, it was very crucial that he is the one that representing Eurozone. If he created a post, Vice President for Euro, he should represent Euro. It does not do the most important, but at least it gives more clarity who from many people dealing with Euro area will represent it, because, well, some consistency is needed, and I am very glad that it's European. What has not been achieved? And I think the biggest challenge starts where the big international institutions are. If you see UN, IMF, World Bank. It's definitely pooling sovereignty would make a sense. At the same time, member states see this as a no-go area in a way. You earn a bit, but also with a lot of difficulties. For IMF and World Bank, I have participating also World Bank meetings in Development Committee. I am sitting as a, guest or observer. I am allowed to speak. It's a big honor. But it's still each member country talk on its own. I would say, well, we know the issues. We know where our position is. Why can't just we be one representation? And I believe it would be definitely very, very important to achieve. Second, what we have not achieved, it is on military. I fully agree, because for me the lowest point that I have had was this force that we tried to prepare for Central African Republic. I understand politically it's a difficult issue, but it was decided politically. And then to prepare the troops was a nightmare. It took ages to prepare rather small troop. I'm glad that Latvians have been part of it. I'm very proud about it. But the whole procedure definitely demonstrates how weakened it, even when the political decision, extremely difficult political decision being taken. But let's take us aside. We took the decision. That was already something. So that I would say it has worked reasonably well. What else I would definitely like that the time consumed in coming to the conclusion would be shorter. And that's definitely that High Representative will be better supported. But I think High Representative started this very clever thing. She tries to get all together all RELEX commissioners. She is very busy. She is called to all across the world. But the first start, when you coordinate others, trade, speak of development, and neighborhood. So I think that is one thing that would be needed. And then, but it's very strongly my personal opinion, I think we should revisit neighborhood policy. We have been too optimistic, and I fully share this. You can't expect that countries with so different history, different sovereignties, you can treat like on matrix. They are too different. I understand it requires more effort. It's true. But at the end of the day, we treat each accordingly. And that, I think, it would be helpful to revisit. And also this neighborhood and Eastern Partnership, it's overlapping concepts. I understand you can't jump and say it's bad. You need first to have new approach. But I believe during Latvian presidency, there will be new Eastern Partnership events. It could be discussed and look, at least for Eastern part. Southern part, in my opinion, is more complicated and more explosive in a way. But it also could be done, and I believe that could be done. And for Latvian presidency, well, I wish all the success. I think they have three basic points. One is difficult and easy at the same time. Prepare well EU common position for post-2015 development conference for financing. It's challenge, but, well, we are inside the house. That is why I'm saying it's not the most difficult. Then big ambition on Eastern Partnership, Central Asia. It's open system. Any progress would be good. I don't expect miracles, but we should deliver what we have objectives are. And then, third, if there are windows of opportunities, and there is always sometimes, or with Russia, or with the Syrian crisis, it would be good to support High Representative as strongly as it's possible, because she is running definitely European foreign policy, but there could be windows of opportunity, perhaps there will be none. But I think Latvia should be prepared that there are such windows of opportunity coming. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Piebalgs, and thank you, everyone. And I only wish that a number of people would have listened to these excellent ideas and been influenced by them, and maybe they will, who knows. We have about 15 minutes for discussion, and I see one hand already, Katrin, and I'm looking for more. Please.
Europäische Politik and also a member of the board. few comments that I would like to make, but first I would like to thank the panelists very much for their different perspectives on the EU foreign policy development that were very insightful and intriguing for me, and very causing also some comments that I would like to make now. First of all, I very much agree with the fact that the regional success is what the EU's foreign policy hinges on. But I think that one thing that we have to keep in mind here is that a crucial point for this is also our relationship with Russia. I'm not saying with Putin, but with Russia. I think if we don't have a medium-term perspective or a medium-term goal also for our ambitions in establishing good relations with Russia, we will not be able to have a successful neighborhood policy, at least in the eastern region. And I think this is something that's not easy to achieve, if at all, but it's something that we should put our efforts into trying to achieve, at least. And I would like to comment also on Gianni. You said that we need to have a good military component of our foreign policy, and I agree, but I think that we should also not forget that we have a very wide understanding of security policy, including also non-military elements. Because especially when we see how the EU is trying to limit its expenses in the foreign policy, I think conflict prevention is cheaper than war, to put it bluntly. I think this also relates strongly to what you said, Hanna, about thinking more strategically and not just writing strategic documents, but also having a strategy in mind behind that. And I think what would be an important step to take in this direction would be to more consciously combine the values that Andris mentioned that are very important in our policy in Ukraine with our interests, and to do so more visibly and also more honestly, maybe a little bit, to show that the values that we follow are not just altruistically motivated, but they are the basis for our interest and our conviction that that's how the world should be governed, so that we can live in a peaceful and prosperous world as well. Yeah, and maybe one comment, of course, that I have to make on Germany, because as a German, I would like to say that I agree with Gianni's reading of the central role of Germany in the European Council on the Ukraine affairs. But I think that the reasons are a little bit different from the ones in the economic affairs, because I think there it's more because of the economic power and role and stability of Germany. I think concerning Ukraine, it is more because Germany has a more middle position as compared to other EU member states, which make it kind of a balancing actor in the European Council. But I still agree with your reading. Thank you very much for letting me make these comments.
Thank you, Catherine. And Vishna.
Can you?
I have a very brief question to Mr. Piebalgs. It was interesting to listen to your speech. So just a quick question. What do you think should be the role of the Latvian presidency, having in mind that the 2015 is the year of development and there is the challenge of the post-millennium goals? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, we can take one question more. Artis Lynch.
Glad to see you all here. Now I'm a politician. You're still doing research, right? How about this question? I was at the Kasekamp conference, European Affairs Committee meeting in Rome on Monday and Tuesday, and you were talking about, it was I think Andris mostly, you were talking about the the internal, shall we call them contradictions in the European Union with regard to the Ukraine. And here they were exposed. Hungary, Slovakia, supported by France and Spain. Well, we did manage to get a very good resolution on Ukraine, and nobody voted against it, but especially because they were all those who wanted a deal with Russia. Let's say it. You said it, right? You said the word. Who wanted a deal? They had left. So we got a unanimous acceptance of the conclusion. Then, what's happening in Germany? I mean, regarding the Spiegel article, after Brisbane, there was not a difference of opinion between Merkel and Steinmeier. There was. It was overcome, but something is also happening there. What about the other countries internally? So they are, how long can we hold out? or Putin is waiting for this until we get tired, and then, well, we have nothing left to do, no more sanctions, it's impossible, right? And then he gets what he wants. Please answer me that question, because I have to deal with this in my parliament, in the European Affairs Committee. We have a meeting next time. After the big Euro meeting, we have to prepare. In Latvia, we give a mandate to the ministers and the Prime Minister going to the big Euro Council, to all the councils in Europe. And here you are. How shall we meet these different currents in the Euro Council on the 18th of December when it all comes to a head?
Thank you very much, Andris. I think we should start now from that corner, starting with Gianni. There are questions to all of you, and some of them have mentioned your name, but feel free to address any of the questions because there were quite a number of them. So
yeah,
please,
comprehensive
Gianni.
approach. Yes, I agree very much that I think Europe, the very first task for Europe, European foreign policy, is to prevent conflicts. But, you know, conflicts sometimes happen without any possibility for Europe to prevent them. So the question, when you speak about comprehensive, that means everything inside. And inside you have also to include a military dimension in order to be credible, first of all. And the second point, second aspect of including a military aspect is in order to avoid the fragmentation of the European Union on particular events, like it happened in Mali, as I repeat, France taking the lead, or to avoid other countries, like it happened for Germany in the Libyan crisis, to get out from the group or to take distance from the group. This was, again, something that visibly gave the impression of a fragmented European Union. And the role of Germany in the Ukrainian case is not just because of, I would say, that the political leadership of Angela Merkel on that particular topic, but it's also due to the economic weight of Germany in relation with Russia and the relationship, bilateral relationship in the economic field and energy field particularly. And I still remember Sergei Karaganov, one of the advisors to Putin and other Russian presidents, who came to our institute and underlined clearly the fact that a compromise with Russia should be reached only through the agreement between Putin and Merkel. That was what he declared. So clearly the image of Europe in a way overlaps with the image of Angela Merkel having the responsibility for such an agreement. So that is, to me, the limits of attributing to the European Council the task of managing foreign and security policy. And unfortunately, the treaty goes in that direction and not in the direction of the High Representative.
Very shortly to Catherine's points on values and interests, yes, that could be a way forward, something very short, if possible, explaining about what values and what interests the EU indeed has. I think that is better than try to arrive at a common analysis of the situation first and a common understanding of a future vision. These things are rather divisive in the end. Particularly this could work if it is a sort of explanation at the same time of what the EU does and why, the reasons. And if it links to the interests of citizens, and they understand that link. So it shows that the EU speaks both languages, the language of values and the language of interests. Thank you.
Challenge to hear?
Well, I felt that when Otis spoke that he was representing what I had just said, and I felt in my presentation here as well that I was playing the role that Otis used to play at our conferences, or taking a similar position. But, I mean, the basic analysis, of course, with not just Putin, but with the general Russian approach to politics, is that power, not values, counts, and thus they respect strength, resoluteness, and at the same time, as I said, they fully expect the West to be wobbly, degenerate, and as the example was given here, that Putin would prefer and expects that he can talk directly to Merkel and get a deal through the leaders in the capitals. A story which many of you probably didn't notice, but was noticed around here a few weeks ago at a historians' conference in Moscow. Putin had justified the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact, which was condemned by the USSR and Gorbachev, and Putin was now justifying it. And it speaks to the same sort of feeling, and I'm not claiming he's going to act as Stalin, obviously, but I'm just saying that he does picture the world in that he can make a deal with the big players, and the EU is irrelevant to this because they will go along with whatever American goes. So the effort is in influencing the big countries. And here's where there's the role of these extremes that I've been talking about. Fortunately, that's not the case yet in Germany, though that's growing in influence. But in France, it's a very serious problem, I would submit. And I mean, I think that speaks to Putin's, and not just his, but a goal of the Russian government to keep Europe divided. And not simply divided, the ultimate success would be to undermine the European Union itself. And the easiest way and the cheapest way to do that is have the Europeans do it themselves. There.
Again, because that is so interesting in your particular field.
Okay, yes. Briefly on German economic foreign policy and how that affects the EU and the external policy as well. On the issue of TTIP, I think it's really interesting because one of the big surprises we've experienced while watching the negotiations is that the public opinion in Germany is very much more against the investor dispute settlement issue than we thought. So we all expected a big French resistance to the agreement, but if we launched it, it's because we thought this will not, handicap an agreement if we excluded audiovisual services and that sort. And then we had a number of very strong countries pro-agreement: Germany, the UK, Spain, and others. But basically, the situation in Germany is a bit paradoxical because, in the middle of the negotiation, this thing comes up, and it becomes more difficult. And I think that actually, if we drop it from the agenda, then the US is going to lose a lot of interest. So we need to see how we can put it on the agenda, but maybe, in the tiny details, make it very light. On the other hand, Germany is the one that invented bilateral investor protections agreement, and it has a number of them, so it's a bit contradictory in a way. But I think that this reflects a bigger, I think, issue in Germany, which I think that has a lot of influence on the evolution of the external economic policy of the EU, which is some ambivalence with leadership in a way. So, for instance, going back to this issue of the euro, I think that clearly we are going towards a multi-currency world with 3 currencies, euro, dollar, and yuan. But basically, once we're there, or we approach there, Europe has to take the decision, the Eurozone has to take the decision if it wants to take some geopolitical advantage of the fact of having one of the reserve currencies. And traditionally, I think that the German position here has been that since leadership in international monetary affairs brings with it some instability in exchange rates, well, that's not something very desirable for a country that exports so much as Germany. So I think there are a number of issues that I think we need to put on the table and see if we get more leadership on the German side, also on the external side, given that we have too much on the internal side, and there's a discussion there if it's the appropriate kind of leadership.
Well, I would try to touch on 3 issues. One, TTIP. From Commission point of view that I left some time ago, the challenge is that who are against is very vocal. Who in favor tries to just to be silent. And that I think is not only with the people, but also with member countries. And the only way really to get wind, at least to come to the essence of this, if some countries would take very strong approach and say, we are in favor, depending definitely on the result of negotiations. And I believe that is very, very crucial. Otherwise, this opportunity will never even be explored at the end of the day. Then on the common positions, that I think is a big Latvia's presidency task. What I would assume that open working groups agreement on the goals, targets is rather good. It's too many perhaps goals, too many targets, but at least there is a right consensus. It's this new style approach. I believe where we need to focus is on accountability and monitoring. What does it help if I say human rights is fine, even in such a detailed way, and then I do nothing against child marriages? There should be global accountability system into it, and then the question also of monitoring should still need to be worked upon. Then the issue of financing, I believe that, well, I would be happy that during this year member countries better start to deliver on the pledge of 0.7% of GNI, because it would be very, very helpful to get credibility in. I doubt that we need to raise this level, but we should discuss also own resources and also share for least developed countries, because a big part of development cooperation goes actually for countries that I would say, well, okay, they could use this money, but perhaps we should not focus so much on these countries. So there is quite a lot of work that Latvians could do, but as I told, it is in discussion in the family, so I am very, very positive that they will manage. There will be a very interesting discussion on gender equality during Latvian presidency. That's also something, and then something for really for think tanks to reflect upon. I know it's not a sexy topic, it's post-Cotonou. If you would ask what I think about it, I am confused. It's unique partnership, but based on very wrong fundamentals. So how to keep the partnership, but change the relationship? And that, I think, is really difficult task. You should not lose something you have achieved, but you know that when you build this agreement, it was a completely different situation. And it will be starting also during Latvian presidency. And now what Atis asked. Where is a watershed? And that's why I said it's dignity, because you can't not react to world events if it happens close to you on human rights events. And what I mentioned, the sanctions that have been done, that's not real sanctions. It's really issues that you can't go below this. Why some member countries are different in it, and there is good news in a way it is, because elections are based less on external policy issues. It's of economic growth issues. And there is always expectation that if you have gas pipeline passing through your country, then you get immediately rich, very rich. And it's not true. And that's why I'm saying the good news are we have the clarity about South Stream. Because South Stream was permanent irritation. Nothing wrong with infrastructure. Russians have been irritated that the third package kills a monopoly on it. Well, it's a EU legislation, but they have permanent irritation with Russia. What? Member countries have been, well, irritated that Commission starts infringement procedure because their agreement with Russia is not according to EU legislation. So it was, but everybody at the same time thought, well, if we get this pipe, perhaps we get cheaper gas price. You will not, because gas price with Russia at least is based on formula. So you can't get the cheaper price, and then you always need to know how you use this gas to added value to sell something in global market. And it's not so evident at the same time. So at least one point of disagreement between member countries Putin has taken out. And that is, in my opinion, good news, because it was permanent issue on the table and irritation in our relationship with Russia and our relationship inside the European Union. So my answer is as told, we should not go below some particular level. That does hurt our dignity, but at the same time, our measures should be according to the WTO rules, standards. We should not go beyond it, and we should not react like Russia did. Well, they prohibited exports of agriculture products against WTO regulation. We should not do this. We should not do this because our base, it should be legally sound, but dignity based. And I believe at the end of the day, we have agreed until now. I'm not afraid that we will abandon for getting cheap benefits. I don't see it. And I believe the most important that there have been public opinion change. I've seen the public opinion figures from Germany where people support it. And that's not easy. I would say in Germany that people says it was the right thing to do. Well, it really means that that was the right thing to do, because in other countries, definitely perspectives or experiences have been different. So for me, it's a big indicator that what was done rightly, and perhaps in some cases could be more fast, but at least it was done with unanimity.
So thank you all the excellent speakers that we've had on this panel, and thank you for the very good questions. Thank you.